mountain where I run, fountain I drink from. Oh, He is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, He is my song. You are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, so good. Oh, you are good, good. Let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, He is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, He is my song. You are good, good. Oh, 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 you're never gonna let me down. 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 You are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, so good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you're never gonna let me down. 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 'Cause you are good, good. You are good, good. You are good, so good. Oh, you are good, good.
Hey everybody, so this is going to be one of the last kind of Tuesday nights, at least on video, that we're going to do. We're going to look what's going to happen in the future. But we have been talking this whole time, 8 weeks or so, I think 7 or 8. It's kind of crazy to think about. about giants that just beat us down, that defy God in our lives. They beat us down. We talked about anger, unforgiveness, rejection, addiction, temptation, all these different things that just kind of own us and beat us down and keep us from God and derail God's plans for our lives. And so we've been talking about the story of David and Goliath and looking at how did David beat the giant that was in front of him, right? And if you can remember all the way back to the beginning of this, the statement was this, and it still holds true, that the story of David and Goliath, it's not about you and I being David. Like, the point of it is not that you're David or that I'm David. And so, be David and just go out and kill your giant, slay your giant, beat your giant, get tough, get strong, pull yourself up, get it done. Like, that's not the point of the story of David and Goliath. We're not David. If we're anybody in the story, then we are the Israelites on the hill who are terrified to go see the giant. That's who we are, right? We're not David. David points forward to a future David. Because after David killed Goliath, which was great for the country, right? They finally defeated this giant. They got some freedom. They still had a bigger giant out there. The giant of sin, death, shame, guilt, temptation, fear, like all these, that giant was still there, keeping them frozen, keeping them trapped, keeping the people of God away from God's plan for them. So the story of David is great. I mean, he kills a physical giant, but there's still this spiritual giant out there. David points forward to a future David who is going to walk out on the battlefield and do what none of us could do. It's interesting and ironic that David was a shepherd boy, right? That the shepherd boy walks onto the field and kills the giant because David points to a future shepherd who's going to go out and kill sin, kill death, kill shame, kill guilt, kill, fear, anger, kill those things and set his people free. I mean, Jesus himself said this. Look at how he identifies himself in John chapter 10, verse 11. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And then he says in verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep. My sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. In one decisive action, Jesus walked out onto the battlefield, endured the cross, and then the resurrection guarantees that he killed whatever giant is holding you down. It is Jesus who is David. It is Jesus who is the better David. He walks out and kills a giant. Listen, this is what I want you to see. That is really good news. Like, if you have been living a Christianity that says, hey, you just need to work harder and get better and be stronger and be more determined and just muscle up and do it. If you've been living that version of Christianity, let me tell you, you are not living real Christianity. That wouldn't be that good of news. It wouldn't be good news for me to tell you, just work harder and be stronger and go out and beat that stuff back. That wouldn't be good news. That would sound like, kind of slavery or me commanding you to just man up. Like, that's not good news. The good news is this, that Jesus fights for us, that Jesus does what we cannot do. That's why the gospel is so good, that as we follow him, as we submit to him, as we walk with him, he is the one that strolls out and defeats the giant and ultimately sets us free. See, I think David kind of knew about this. I think David saw the writing on the wall, right? He knew a Messiah was coming. He knew a shepherd was coming. He knew someone far greater than him was going to go out and conquer the real giants that were in the path of the people. I think David saw this because David wrote an unbelievably familiar and popular psalm. You've heard this psalm a lot of times. I want to read it tonight. Tonight's going to be really short compared to the other nights. You're probably thinking that's great, right? But I want to read you this psalm, and I just want to notice three really important lines. There's a lot of really important phrases in it, but I just want to notice three really important lines as we kind of wind this series down. It's Psalm 23. Here's what David says. This is kind of how he relates to God. Look at what he says. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This is how David saw God. He said, man, I know shepherds. I know what it means to be a good shepherd. I've been a shepherd. As I look at God, I realize and recognize that God is my shepherd. And then Jesus would come and say, I'm the good shepherd. Like David saw these qualities in God. And I want to really just look at three really important phrases in there in 3 points. It's going to be really quick. But the first kind of pops up in Psalm 23:4. So just look at verse 4. It'll be on the screen. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. So David's writing this psalm, and I can't help but think when he wrote the line like, even though I walk through the darkest valley, as he was writing those words, I can't help but think that he pictured and he thought of the valley of Elah. You remember the valley of Elah? It's a small detail. You might have missed it. But the valley of Elah was the valley where Goliath stood. If you remember the story, it's in 1 Samuel 17. The Israelites are on one hill. The Philistines are on the other hill. In between them is a valley. It's called the valley of Elah. Goliath would come down every day and stand in that valley and defy God, terrify the Israelites. It was in the valley of Elah that David had to walk down to fight the giant. Just imagine for a second. Can you imagine how terrified David must have been in those moments as he was walking down the hill into the valley? Can you imagine how terrified he was? Yeah, we know that David had great faith, and I'm sure he had great faith. I know he had great faith from the story. Like, he had great faith. I get that. But still, that doesn't mean that victory is assured. David has to have, in his brain thinking, it's possible, I could die here. It's terrifying to walk into a dark valley with a giant. But David in this psalm says this. He goes, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. See, David saw something that you need to see. And David knew something that you need to know. And that is this. I think as he was walking down that hill into the valley, I think he saw, and I think he knew, God, my shepherd, is walking with me in this valley. God, my shepherd, is beside me right now. God, my shepherd, is carrying a rod and staff. In fact, I know I have 5 rocks in a sling, and I got a plan in my head. I'm going to throw those at the giant's head, but I know, right? I know ultimately it's going to be God's rod and God's staff that's going to knock this giant down. My shepherd is with me in this valley. Here's the first point that I want to point to is this. You are not alone. You're not alone. The good shepherd walks with you. Can we just again, and I know we've talked about it, but let's just talk about, man, this has been a dark valley. It's crazy to think about 2 months. This has been a dark valley, full of uncertainty, full of fear. And in the midst of that, your giant has probably had a field day. It just loves it. It's eating it up. You're walking through a valley. You have no way to go around this valley. None of us do. Everyone from the poorest of the poor to the richest of the rich is walking through this right now together. We have no way around it. We're walking down to the valley. You need to know this. You are not alone. God, Jesus, the good shepherd, is walking with you. He's carrying a rod and a staff. He is walking beside you. Look up. You're not alone. That's the first thing I want to point. But there's another verse that's also really important. Look at this. 23:5 says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Now notice this is really important. He says, in the presence of my enemies is where I sit down with you and have a feast. I'm surrounded by my enemies. And in the midst of being surrounded, in the midst of battle, in the midst of turmoil and stress and all this stuff, in the midst of it, it's like God whips out a table and a tablecloth and lays down this huge feast, and it's a table for two. It is me and the Lord. In the presence of my enemies, God prepares, God provides, and God sits with me. And I feast with God. Now, let me just tell you, what you already know. If we were to write the Bible, like by committee, like let's all agree what we're going to do when we're going to write the Bible, and we would do that, we would not write that verse. Right? We would say, after you slaughter my enemies and after they are all destroyed, that is when in your presence alone I sit and we have a feast. After they're all dead and gone, it's just me and you. In your presence alone, I sit and have a feast. That's not what David wrote. Under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, David wrote, no, in the presence of my enemies. I think that what we often want when we walk into the valley, and what we often want when we walk through a battle or through a storm, is that we want God to hit the eject button for us as quickly as possible. God, get me out of this, eject me out of this, pull me out of this storm, get me out of this turmoil and stress, get me out quickly, get me out, right? That's how we would write it. That's how we would want it. But that's not what God often does. God doesn't often get us out of these storms really quickly or when we want them. God often doesn't pull us out of the battle exactly when we want it. God sometimes says, no, while you're in the midst of this, let's sit and feast. Let me prepare with you, right? You come to me, and in the midst, while you're being surrounded by your enemies, while stress and pressure are bearing in, you sit and you feast. Your soul finds refreshment sitting with me. This leads to the second point, which is this. You are provided for. The shepherd has prepared a table for you right now. The question is, are you going to sit with him? Right? I can make you a great feast. I can invite you over to my house. I can grill you some steaks and, baked potatoes and all that, shrimp on the grill and all that delicious food. I can prepare you a feast and say, hey, you're invited. But the question is, do you accept the invitation to come and sit and eat with me? Right? The Lord has prepared a table for you. In the midst of all of this, the question is, will you come into his presence and find refreshment for your soul? The Lord's provided for you in the presence of your enemies. I think sometimes we get our prayer a little bit wrong because we are so desperate for God to hit the eject button as quickly as possible that we only pray for that. Just, God, get me out of this as quickly as possible. And what we should do, and I'm not saying that prayer is wrong, but it's only half of the prayer, to say, but Lord, if you don't, help me to find your presence in the middle of the storm. Help me to find your presence in the middle of the battle. Help me to find your presence in the presence of my enemies. Help me to find refreshment right here, because your word promises you prepared a table for me in the presence of my enemies. One other verse I want to look at, and that is this. Psalm 23:6. Here's what it says. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. It's the last verse of the psalm. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. Here's what David knew. David knew this. I'm not doomed. I am not doomed. As I look behind me, I see God's goodness and love following me. As I look in front of me, surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I look in front of me, I see where I'm going. I look behind me, I see God's goodness and love. I'm surrounded. I am not doomed. I don't know if you're like me. Maybe you're not. I hope you're not sometimes, right? But I don't know if you're like me. But here's what I have a tendency to do. I get in the middle of the dark valley or the storm or the battle, whatever you want to call it. I get in the middle of that pressure cooker, and my mind can only imagine the worst outcomes. And my mind can't see how this will get solved. And so my mind goes crazy. And I begin to think to myself, I'm doomed. There's no way out of this. I'm stuck. Everything's bad. All solutions are going to be bad. I just start spinning out of control. I'm doomed. I'm doomed. I'm doomed. If you're like me and you're doing that, let me just tell you, that is totally backwards to the Christian faith. Because if you are following Christ, if the Good Shepherd is in your life, you are never doomed. It's as if you're, driving a car When you look in the rearview mirror, you don't see carnage and wreckage behind you in your life. You might see some potholes and some swerves and stuff, but what you see is this, that God's goodness and love were with me all along. He guided me through those times. And then when you look ahead, you see like David, and I'm going to live with the Lord forever in his house. So I don't see carnage and wreckage. What I see is God's provision and love. And when I look in front of me, I see God, eternity with God in his house. The third point is this: you are not doomed. God's goodness and love will follow you. You're not doomed, right? Here's what I want you to know. Who could have anticipated that in the middle of a semester, right before spring break, you're dismissed from school and everything goes online and a pandemic shuts down our country and causes an economic collapse? Who could have anticipated that? Nobody. No one saw that. I mean, this has been a dark valley. It's probably been a dark valley for you for a variety of reasons. I know it's been a dark valley for me, and for a lot of different reasons. It's been a hard time for me and for my family and for the folks that are around. I know that is true for all of us. What I want you to hear is this, that as we walk through this, and maybe it's coming to an end, and maybe it's going to go on for a long, long time, and we just don't know. But as you walk through the valley, know this: the Good Shepherd walks with you. His rod and his staff, they'll comfort you and they'll protect you. The Good Shepherd's going to provide for you. As long as you accept the invitation, he's there daily to meet with you, and in his presence, your soul will find nourishment. And the Good Shepherd guarantees that you're not doomed. And as you get out of the valley and look back, what you're going to see is God's goodness and love moving with you all the way through. And as you look forward, you're going to see the promise that you're going to spend the rest of your days with the Lord in his house. You are not doomed. I don't know what the future holds for you, but I know this: God's a good shepherd. And as you submit to Jesus, and as you rely on the gospel and spend time in his word, and as you obey, and as you submit your life to him, I promise you this: Jesus will walk onto the battlefield, and your giant, whatever it is going down. Trust Jesus now. Turn to him. Sit at the table with him for a while. Find nourishment for your soul. We hope to see you in Zoom tonight.
You are good, good.